Welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 145. If you're wanting to improve your understanding of photography, then you're in the right place. Composition, lighting, narrative, all these kind of things. Make sure you subscribe, click like, click the notification bell so you know when future episodes are turning up as well. And if you are watching live, then leave a comment. Let me know where you are, and we'll make a start. So yes, hello and welcome. Today we have 4 images sent in by Roy, Robert, Rosemary and Viji. So we're going to be looking at those, quite a wide range of ideas and thoughts and bits and pieces behind them. So I'll be giving feedback on these, and in the process of giving the feedback, as usual, there'll be all sorts of aspects of composition and lighting and all the rest of it, and editing techniques that come out in the process. If this is something you would like to take part in yourself, you haven't done so already, then understand that there's a Facebook group, also called Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, where you can submit your images and tell me what your sticking point is, where your difficulty lies with them. Or if you don't do Facebook, or you just don't really fancy putting it on a Facebook group, then you can email me directly, kim@kimayres.co.uk. So just kim@kimayres.co.uk. And again, if you send me the image, tell me what your sticking point is, and I will do my best to help you. So yes, here we are, live, episode 145, and I can see we've got a few people in already with comments. So, Robert's here, says, howdy all from a sunny Texas. Rosemary says, good morning/afternoon/evening, hope everyone is well. After two glorious spring days, we're back to clouds in the Pacific Northwest America. Maggie says, hello everyone from Castle Douglas. Roy says, hello from a glorious West Yorkshire. Well, West Yorkshire is of course always glorious, but I guess you mean the weather's good too. Meg says, good afternoon everyone. John Harvey says, good day from Columbus, Ohio, where it is too cold for my liking. Fair enough. Oh, Naria's joined us, says, hi everyone from Exmouth, UK. It's Mother's Day here today in the UK, so for all of you mothers out there, have a lovely day. And you beat me to it, Naria. That's right, today in the UK is Mother's Day. So, happy Mother's Day to all of you who are mothers, all of you who have mothers, all of you who had mothers, all of you who like to celebrate it. Don't you kind of just enjoy, make the most of the moment. Anne's joined us and says hello from Dallas as well. Right, okay, so, one other quick note, and I will try and remember to remind you at the end of the podcast as well, is the clocks in the UK go forward 1 hour next week. So it happens in the middle of the night, so like 2 a.m. on Sunday morning. So what it means is podcast next week and episode 146 on the 26th of March. We will then be 1 hour ahead from where we are. So for those of you in North America, that just means you kind of catch up to where we were a couple of weeks ago, and it's back to business as usual. For those of you who are further east, like Viji in India, then you will suddenly find that I think everything basically is about an hour earlier. So if you're currently watching this at 8:30 in the evening, it'll drop forward to 7:30, I think. But if all else fails, Google it. In fact, that's a very good idea. Just Sunday morning or whatever, make sure you Google the time difference. So next week will be different. I will, like I said, we'll try and remind you at the end, and I will try and stick a note up on the Facebook group some point this week to try and act as a reminder as well. Having said that, if you come to the YouTube channel here, and usually within a day or so, I have the next episode live ready to come up. So if you click on it, it says it will be coming up on the 26th of March. There's usually a little notification button. Make sure you hit the notification button and you will be reminded. Although I don't know how far in advance they remind you, but it's another option. Oh, Viji has just joined us from India. So yes, Viji, in case you didn't catch that, clocks go forward by next week. So as from next Sunday, these podcasts will be an hour earlier for you. I don't know whether that makes things easier or more difficult. But anyway, here in the UK, they carry on being at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It's just time moves, daylight savings time. Okay, so here we are. We have people, we have pictures, we have a podcast to move on with. So what are we going to start with? So I think now that I know that Viji's here, I think what we might actually do is start with Viji. And what Viji sent in this photo, and is really wanting to get a sense of composition. With regards to composition, I would really request your critique for this one. So I understand this was taken by Viji on a recent trip to Goa, was it? So off with work colleagues and friends, some various bits of lovely architecture, wonderful weather and climate, I think it is there. And she took this photo. So what are we talking about there? So first of all, yep, lovely buildings, lovely shade of green. Sun looks like it's starting to get a little bit lower in the sky. Shadows are getting longer. It's nice, kind of almost getting to that kind of slightly golden quality to it. And you've got your friend there leaning out, holding onto a pole. So composition. What's happening here? What might have been done differently? There are a couple of things that strike me here with this, and I think, tell you what, let's open this up in Photoshop, and we can run through a couple of different options or things to keep in mind with something like this. Now, the first thing that strikes me is the fact that it's an interesting looking building, and presumably this is what's grabbed you. This is what's made you think about taking the photo. We've got these. We've got the poles going up. We've got some kind of fencing up on the balcony, banistering. We've got this sort of lovely kind of ridging here, arched doorways. You know, it's quite an interesting architecture, even kind of interesting little light fittings there as well. Plants outside the door. And I'll just change this workspace over. There we go, so that I'm not cutting off half the picture. And also the fact is you've taken it at an angle as well. So what it's giving is it's giving us a sense of depth. If you turn around and taken this photo straight on, then the only amount of depth you would have had would have been pretty much her from the curb to the wall behind you. But you've tilted it so to get a sense of the length of the building disappearing down behind her. Now you've done that, the question is maybe, I think, with something like this, two things really. One is I think it would have been nicer to get more of the building. To maybe step back, if you just step back a couple more feet, maybe get a little bit more of what's going on up here. Maybe get a little bit more length going down the rest of it as well. And the other thing here, instantly noticeable to my eye, is we've got bottles of water, a hat, and these things look like they've just been quickly put down or out the way, but they do kind of grab the attention a little bit. So what we'll do is just very quickly, so that we can I'll just kind of quickly remove them. It's not really wanting to do it, but that'll do for the moment. Now, like I say, really with this, what I kind of want to do is sort of bring it down a little bit more like that. But the problem is if we do that, we then lose some of that balustrade at the top there, which I think is quite interesting. And like I say, ideally, I think if you'd been stepped back a little bit further, you might have got more of that in. So you kind of want to sort of end up, I find I kind of want to end up sort of stretching it out this way a bit to get more of the sense of this length of building. Now, if I do content-aware fill at this point, this is going to fill in something, but it's really kind of making a little bit of a mess over there. What I might want to do is even, let's say, grab a chunk of that, copy and paste, and obviously as we move it over here the perspective's wrong, so if I can Control T, and now what I can do is shrink that down. Now this isn't to say that you should really be messing about in Photoshop in this way. All I'm trying to do is just give you a slightly different sense of what in fact actually we can probably go to, no, where are we? No, we are on that door. Okay. Just trying to give you a sense of, had the perspective been slightly different, might have had something like that. So that's just giving us a little bit more sense of the space here, and then I'll just kind of tidy up that a little bit. But then the other problem is with this, whilst it's a nice kind of building, I think the real thing here, Viji, is that what you have is you've got your friend here at the front. So your friend here is at the front, and that's fine. But the lines of the building take us down the street. They actually draw us away from her. So because it's sort of narrowing in, it feels like the arrow of our vision, as such, is pointing in this direction. And of course, that's pointing away from her. Because it opens up, it's not really pointing towards her, it's kind of pointing away. So to create a reasonable composition like this, really kind of what you want to do is have her shifted back somewhere over here. Now, just to give you a sense, what I'll do is, if I go to select subject, if we're really lucky here, yep, Photoshop is getting so much better at doing this. So we've essentially selected her, and then what I can do is I can copy and paste and then drag her over this way. Now, a couple of things we'll need to do. Again, if we want her further down, we'll need to shrink her down to give her a little bit more perspective. We want her up against, say, that pole or something like that. Maybe she's slightly too tall on that one for this perspective, just trying to get a rough sense. Doesn't really matter. I'm not really suggesting you go into Photoshop and move her. All I'm trying to do is give you a suggestion of how this might be laid out slightly differently. And at this point, what we want to then remove her from this one. So again, what I might do is, in fact, actually probably the easiest thing, if I go back to that select subject again, and then do right, no, that's not quite what I want to do. There's an option here, and suddenly I've forgotten where to find it, which is no, somewhere. Right click, content aware fill. That's what I'm trying to do. So that's and then just click apply, and OK. So that's deleted her. Having said that, it's not deleted her particularly well. Doesn't really matter. We're just trying to get a sense of her out of the picture at the moment. Now, the other thing is, having her at the back, the slight problem as well that we have is the fact that she's got a green top that, and the rest of the building is green. So she does get slightly lost. So maybe at this point, what we do, if we come into, let's just say, if I do a hue saturation layer and let's select the greens, and I click the little clipping bit here, so it's only affecting the layer below, which in this case will be her, and we're only selecting the greens, and I slide that. Where are we? Why is that not actually making any difference? That ought to be greens, you would have thought. Okay, let's select this top. Maybe it's just, it's gone into the yellows. There we go. So maybe we can kind of give her a blue top or something like that. Just makes her stand out a little bit more. And again, we're not really wanting all the rest of her face and skin. I don't. It's kind of grabbed everything there. So let's just rub the rest out. We're only really wanting that to happen on her top. So a blue top then, or maybe you could have gone for a red top or any other colour top. There we go. You see that. In fact, actually, red doesn't quite stand out as much because of the orange door behind. So in this case, maybe something like a blue works a little bit more. You could up the saturation. So, point being then, Viji, that in terms of composition, the idea that you've got, I think, to start with, was quite a good one. You know, you've seen the building. You've thought, let's angle the camera and get a sense of the length of the diagonals in the building. You've got your friend leaning off the pole. So I can see what you were going for. But if you kind of find yourself in this situation, again, understand that the perspective shift, the lines going down as you move, mean that the eye draws you down towards it. And so essentially your friend needs to be further down so that the lines are drawing your eye towards her. Now we have her in the shot. Our eye gets drawn here, but we're very aware then of the building that she's standing next to. Whereas when we go back to the original photo, we maybe get drawn to her, but the building itself, which is part of the interest of it, kind of gets a little bit lost. So I hope that gives you a few ideas there, Viji. I mean, like I said, I'm not really saying go and muck about in Photoshop like this much, because no, it's the amount of work you've got to do to actually make it look convincing is probably not worth it. But this is more about this idea of, you wanted to know about composition. I think this is the kind of composition. But like I say, also, if you stood a little bit further back and get some of this upper floor, I think also maybe looks a little bit interesting. So I hope that gives you some ideas, Viji. But thank you very much for sending that one in. Right, let's close that. Right, now as you can see, we've got a few more comments. So where did we get to? Oh, Viji says, thanks for the heads up over the time. Oh, Stacey's joined us from Hatboro, Pennsylvania, and Sandra's joined us from a sunny Birmingham. Stacey says it's cold and windy day, but the sun is shining. Viji said, taken several shots of this angle, lots of disturbances, bikes in between, so posted this one. Yeah, I mean, of course, there's always the problem that, you know, there's the difference between setting up the photo and waiting for all the right, you know, and putting all the conditions in the right place, and there's grabbing what you can under the circumstances. Absolutely. But if you can understand the general sense of the concept of what's going on, then maybe it kind of helps when you're in that situation to start kind of thinking, well, okay, these are the shapes I've got. How can I use these shapes, rather than just quickly run over there, stand there, and I'll go click. And that's then maybe the difference between having a snapshot, which is great, nice little memory of what you did, but trying to elevate the photo a little bit further. Okay, Viji says, understand now, looks perfect. April says, hello everyone, beautiful green building. I'm glad you could join us, April. And she's saying, I missed your photos, Viji. All right, okay, so April and Viji having a little chat there. So let's move on then. So let's move on to Roy. So Roy, where are we, Roy? Roy sent us this photo. Yes, here we go. And said, Roy, advice on this, please. I'm struggling to get detail in the highlight area. This is a backlit display indoors in Salt Mill, Saltire. The raw image is in black and white. Sorry, the raw image is in black and white, and I had to, as I had my camera set for mono, JPEG, and RAW, but it opens up in colour. Can the detail be rescued? I'm not sure quite why it opens up in colour if you had it set for black and white, unless it was sort of set for black and white for JPEG, and then the RAW has contained the colour information, which is quite often what happens. In which case, actually, that's what I would suggest you do. I would never suggest to do. In fact, actually, I don't tend to suggest the idea that you ever do anything in black and white in camera, because then your camera is making decisions for you that you can't change. Later on, if the camera has decided to lose the colour information in a particular way, you can't go back and change that. You might remember on many occasions I've done black and white conversions, and that there are actually several different ways to convert to black and white, each of which has its own advantages and disadvantages, will lighten some colours, darken other colours, create different levels of contrast. And all those potential options are lost to you if you let the camera make the decision for you at the point you go click. So I would always recommend take the photo in colour and then convert it to black and white afterwards in the editing process. Okay, having said that, we're not worrying about a black and white picture just now. We have a colour picture. But as well as the fact that the highlights are very blown here, it is intensely noisy. There's an awful lot of noise in this photo. So it's looking very high ISO, or you've kind of dragged stuff out of the shadows in post-processing, but maybe not paid too much attention to the noise levels that happens with it. So I can answer, but concept-wise, we're looking over this man's shoulder at the picture in the background, but the problem is the picture itself is blown out with the highlights. So, however, Roy has sent me the original RAW file, which certainly makes my job a little easier. If you are sending me images and you are sending me a pre-edited image, or an edited image, it's always really useful if you also send me the unedited version as well, because at that point we can often explore extra options. So when I look at this, what I can see up here is we're on ISO 6400. Right, so okay, so it's obviously quite dark. Now you're on f8, 1/80th of a second. Presumably you're not wanting to go below 1/80th of a second, because then just general handshake is going to kind of create a bit of blur. F8's quite deep. When you're in a dark, sometimes you might want to kind of open up the aperture a bit more. Having said that, if you're wanting to get the man in focus and the picture behind him in focus, then you probably are needing something like an F8. So that's a difficult one. So the only option left open to you was to go full ISO, which is, in this case, 6400. But it does create a noisy picture. Now, we also see with this that there's not a lot of detail. Now, this is where it's really coming out in there's a certain amount that you can recapture in the editing. Because here I am, I've opened this in Camera Raw, and if I grab the highlight slider and drag it down, do you see that actually we get quite a bit more? Now, we still don't have the full picture, but if you take a look at something like this little tree area over his shoulder, when this was at normal, or highlight 0 there, we're just getting a little bit of line. As I drag the highlights down, you see there's an awful lot more information in here than we realized that there was. And this is the great thing about shooting in RAW. Now, when we start out, we shoot in JPEG. RAW is a bit scary. It's an extra level of editing, and maybe we don't need to. Often the JPEG seems to do a better job than we knew what to do with RAW anyway. And that's fine. Like I've said, with a lot of auto settings, depending on where you are with the camera, start off using the auto settings, because 8 times out of 10, the camera will do a better job on it than you will by trying to adjust it. But sometimes there comes a point where the camera's auto settings aren't doing what you want them to do. They also, maybe they don't bring out the details. They expose in the wrong area. They focus in the wrong area. You need to be able, when you get to the point where you feel you are getting irritated or annoyed by the auto settings, that's the point where you really need to start going, well, okay, what do I need to learn to go beyond the auto settings so that you have control over the different aspects. And as time goes on, the more you do this, the more photography you do, the more you get into your photography, the more ownership you want to take of each of the different processes. It will move at a natural rate. There's nothing to say that you have to instantly, when you first pick up your camera for the first time, instantly be going into RAW. It'll probably scare most people off. But there will come a time when you just kind of find yourself getting irritated by the fact that a JPEG isn't doing what you want to do. And 9 times out of 10, that's because it's losing information that you want to have. And in this case, just by going to RAW and dragging down the highlights, we've managed to recover information. Now, I can take the exposure down as well, but all that's doing now is making the whites grey. So maybe actually, if I nudge that down a little bit, I notice there's a little tiny bit more comes up there. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take that down just a fraction more. And I think that's about the limit. Any more than that, all it's doing is just making everything grey, but a little bit down, and I've got a little bit more texture out of these branches. Now, the other problem we've got is we've still got this very high ISO. So what I'm going to do now this is in Camera Raw. I think, Roy, you said you use Affinity. I don't know how that works, but it will probably have something similar. There will be a detail option here for sharpening and noise reduction. Now, one of the things Photoshop always seems to do is default to a sharpening at a level of 40, which is always way too sharp. Now, if I take the sharpness down, that gets rid of some of the noise. Then I boost the noise reduction up, and that gets rid of more of the noise. Now, the problem is as we get rid of more of the noise, we also do lose some of the more fine detail that we've just been trying to rescue as well. So it's a balance. The problem is when you are at 6400 ISO, you've already lost a lot of information. The camera noise is trying to make up for it, but it's struggling really hard. So there's a balance. There's a balance to be found. So if we do that, and I come back out here, the whole thing has kind of become a little bit darker. Maybe we at this point want to bring some of the shadows up a little bit, but every time we bring the shadows up, we are also adding to the amount of noise that's coming in. So we're kind of, I say, let's just open this as it is, and then we can do the other bits of edits you did, which was sort of straighten it in and kind of make him a little bit more in the center of the picture, something like this. And then maybe at this point what you want to do is you could do a more kind of general lightening, kind of bring the curves up a little bit like that if you wanted, except for the fact that we don't want to lose the definition here. So then you would kind of mask back in the screen and let's just put that back onto a brush, and then paint that screen back in so that we've still got the details. So having lightened it, we don't want to lose those details. So we've, using the mask, I've masked off the curves, the amount we've lightened, so that what's underneath that, the layer underneath, is still showing us. So that's now giving you more details. Now, it presumably still doesn't have as much detail as there might have been in the first place. And if we come back to your photo here, you know, as you can see, there's a lot more detail missing. To go back to the bit, can any detail be rescued? So the amount that I've rescued in this, I would say, is the limit to where it can be rescued from the raw file that you have. So the whole point with the raw file is you open up in raw, drag those highlights down and see what can be rescued out of the highlights. Just in the same way, if you're doing it on a picture that's maybe a bit too dark, is there anything in the shadows? Drag the shadows to the sliders and move it to the right and see if there's detail to be recovered from the shadows. That's your starting point. Beyond that, if you were wanting to have more detail out of this picture in the first place, what you would needed to have done was to expose for the screen on the wall. Because what's happened is when we go back to your basic raw file, if we open this here, is the brightness of the screen here has darkened everything down a bit, but it's not, it's still picking up light around the place. And overall, the screen itself is just too bright for the exposure settings that you had. So you've got f8 1/80th of a second. Actually, maybe what you needed to do was have, say, 120th of a second, 125th of a second, or 160th of a second. Now, at that point, everything else would have become much darker, but what was on the screen may well then have got the exposure right for that. The other option is to then do multiple exposures, where you do, if you can keep the camera dead steady, particularly if you've got it on a tripod, or you can rest it on a shelving unit or a table or something, then you can take more than one photo, and you take one which is exposed for the highlight area, one which is exposed for the shadow area, maybe one or two in between, and then you can combine them in your editing software as well. And then that allows you to give that's where the kind of whole HDR high dynamic range comes from. It allows you to have the fullest range between the shadows and the highlights, because the camera itself, generally speaking, can't match what the eye can match. So I hope that helps, Roy. I hope that gives you a sense of what's going on. So yes, you can rescue a certain amount from the highlights in your raw file, but ultimately, if you really want to make sure that you can get the maximum out of the picture, then you have to expose for that. But then if you're going to lose too much in the shadows, you also have to maybe take a second photo where you expose for the shadows and then blend them together in your editing software. So, hope that helps. Thank you for sending that one in, Roy. So, a couple more comments. Where are we? Rosemary says the exercise of fiddling in Photoshop is a good idea for training us to plan ahead for the future. I'm glad you find it useful. What else do we have? Yeah, Viji says, yes, thanks so much for your feedback. I will pay more attention next time while taking the photo itself. Hopefully. We kind of get there. In the rush of the moment, trying to remember all these things isn't always easy. But the more you do it, the more you can think about it, the more often it will work. Rosemary says, my camera saves all the colour info in RAW and the black and white setting is a second file. Fair enough. We have Eric Swain says hello from Minnesota, where it's always winter and never Christmas. Welcome, Eric. I'm sure it's not always winter in Minnesota. I bet in the summer it is swelteringly hot. April says, I like the concept of this photo. Stacey says, interesting type of photo. You have to imagine what thoughts someone is thinking. Viji says the stance is good and the jacket, liking the shot. The floor has great texture. Sandra says a good capture of someone in a museum. And Stacey says it looks like a very large window, but could be a gallery just because of the panes. Meg says, I really like the shape of the twigs in the snow in front of the man. And yes, so little bits of comments going on. And Roy says, thanks Kim, that was very helpful. Excellent, glad it was. Okay, so Little reminder that if you find these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, and you would like to support them, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. Right, okay, we have a couple more photos to look at. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at Rosemary. Now, Rosemary said, my photo sticking point this week has a little to do, has to do with how little and how much to include in the frame. Seems like this is an issue for many of us that the group struggle with fairly regularly. What is the best way to include enough story while isolating the subject so the viewer knows where to pay attention? Are there criteria we can use to know that our images accomplish the goal of telling the story of the subject as simply and clearly as possible? Now, the example she's using, the picture I'm sending shows our cat peering over a stack of folded laundry waiting to be put away. So, this is Rosemary's edited photo. So, got cat peering over the laundry. Now, what she's also done is sent a couple of other versions of this photo. So this is the edited version, this is the unedited version. This is a version she took where she sort of stood back a little bit further. This was the kind of mid-range, edited, cropped in a little bit further, and this is one where she just zoomed right in. The only one she sent me that was edited is this one, but that's okay. So she says, the picture, I love this picture because it captures his blend of curiosity and laziness, wanting to supervise what's going on the other side of the stack without exerting himself by actually getting up. He was diagnosed with a brain tumour not long after this image was taken, so this is the last pictures I have of him where his personality shines. I'm sorry to hear about that, Rosemary. There are 3 unedited views of the same scene. The first includes more of the environment, the second is a medium shot, and the third is the close-up scene. I chose to spend my time editing on the medium shot, tightening in the crop a little bit. My reasoning for going into this one is that, to me at least, it conveys the sense of the scene without the distraction of the clutter of my husband's nightstand or our other cat drawing attention away from the main subject. The close-up didn't seem to do the job of telling where he was or what he was peering over. Laundry was one of our kitty's obsessions, which a casual viewer wouldn't know of him, but is important to anyone. Is an important part of the memory to anyone who knew him. The edit crops out just enough for the second cat that he's unidentifiable as a cat, more like just another lump of laundry. I left the photo on the wall to balance the weight on the left side, but maybe it's a bit distracting. The background is darkened and the main subject sharpened to draw the eye. Does the edited version accomplish what I'm hoping, or have I settled for the wishy-washy middle ground? Am I asking the right kinds of questions? Okay, so there's quite a lot in your talk here, but really what it boils down to is a kind of an age-old problem, as you say, is one that we've talked about quite often before, which is you have a subject and how much of the environment do you include with it? Is it about the cat in the environment, or is it really about the environment supporting the cat? And if we go to the close-up version or something like that, then at this point it's all about a cat's head. We don't really know what the environment is. I mean, we can see a little bit of pillow at the back, so we would know that. We wouldn't know that this was a set of laundry. At this point, then, what we have is we have a cat, but we've got a cat with half its face missing, or with its mouth missing. And so actually, as a photo of a cat, it's kind of missing half the face. It's not really giving us a real sense of what's going on. This is cat with laundry pile. This is the unedited version, includes a little bit of other cat in the background. This is then cat, laundry pile, on the bed, other cat, possibly. Now we know it's another cat. We know we can see that it's a cat rather than another crumpled up or a piece of laundry. But there's other bits. We have bedside lamp, we've got bottle of drink, picture up in the corner here, which you can't see because I'm currently blocking it here. So the question is which to go for? And I think it's kind of a tricky one. Part of my feeling is that with all of them, the cat's face is blocked. And so the story is the cat peering over the top of the laundry. If it was more about the cat itself in the environment, then you would need to see more of the cat. The fact that half the cat, or the lower half of the cat's face, is missing feels like you would only do that if there was a bigger story to tell. Why else would you kind of cut somebody's face off? You need something about that environment to reflect it. So in that sense, I kind of get slightly more drawn to the even further back part of it. I quite like that sense of the larger environment. And in some ways, I kind of feel like I almost want to make it even larger. Now, this gets tricky because there is only a certain amount of the room you can probably fit in with this. And also because there are, you know, there are the bed covers and there's all the bits and pieces. If you kind of pull out too far, potentially the cat itself gets lost. So if I, let's just open this with Photoshop for a moment. Just close that one from Roy, and we come here. So if we use that content aware thing here to try and make this bigger, something like this, which is maybe where I would want to be starting to think about, then obviously if this was actually more of the room, then I think you've got this room, you've got a pile of laundry, and then you've got the cat's head. Now, maybe at that point you also do the editing which you did, which was to brighten up the cat's head itself, maybe darken down a little bit, but you do something to draw attention to the cat, even though it's in a much larger space. You then need to kind of highlight that. And so, as you say, you might just kind of brighten that part, brighten and sharpen the cat's head at that. So you're noticing then the eyes that are appearing over the top. And in fact, to make the most of that, I would possibly even want to have something like this. However, the problem is at this point, I mean, well, the content aware isn't knowing what to do, but I'm gathering the end of the bed would be here. We would then have other stuff going on. There might be bits of wall, bits of window, bits of other thing, which is just making, I don't know whether there's anything up on the wall either. But it is that notion, I think, of what you're kind of wanting is the power in a photo like this is the fact that at first glance, what you see is a scene, and then your eye is drawn to the fact that there is this cat pointing over. So at that point, maybe if we can't go that big, maybe what we do is we come in something like this and actually go for tall rather than so we've got enough here to have the so we can see the pile of clothes, but we've also now got the cat. But there's also now, maybe if you had a photo on the wall or a painting or some interesting light coming through the window, shadows from flickering trees or something like that. So this big chunk of wall in and of itself is just kind of too empty. But assuming that we had a you got a painting up here somewhere with a little bit of landscape and a tree. I'm a photographer, not an artist. And you know, a little bird flying in there. That's awful. That is truly awful. My apologies. But the point being is that if you had something up here, that's way too bright and distracting. But you can see where have I gone? I've gone redo last content. Yeah, there we go. But if you had something up here that was just sort of filling in the space, then what you've got is you then also need to bring attention to the fact that that has laundry. So you would still need to edit this up a little bit. Let's just kind of let's do an auto there, do a little bit of clarity, something like that. Maybe bring the exposure down a touch. But yeah, you maybe sort of, again, perhaps darken down the foreground and the top a little bit, but allow the cat to stand out. And it's, I think something like that, you just the idea that I think your cat needs, the story is the fact that the cat is peering over the edge of the laundry. So it's kind of like a stealth maneuver. And so you don't want it sort of being noticed in the first fraction of a second, but you do want it being noticed in the second fraction of a second. So I think you need to have a larger kind of environment while still allowing a way to find a way to draw attention to the cat. So I hope that makes sense, Rosemary. I think it is always a difficult one. Like I say, most photos are usually improved by either moving in closer or stepping back further. And the 3 photos that you sent in was you trying to do precisely that. It's just that I tend to think actually the stepping back further might have required stepping back even further. Alternatively, you know, if you're going for the close-up like this one, because there's not enough going in, this is the point where you almost go real close-up, where we kind of, what we do is we start going, oh, there's reflections in the eye there. There's a little bit of window light here. Now, this is only a smaller version. You didn't send me the full-size version of this, but it's possible inside the full-size version. If you happen to have got the eye absolutely in focus, if that's really sharp enough in focus, then you might actually be able to lighten up some of the background and see reflection in that kind of beautiful, like a convex mirror, curved sense of the wall and the room behind the eye, you know, reflected in the eye. And at that point, something like that becomes interesting, and you've got just enough cat to know that it's a cat eye that you're looking in, but actually the real focus of the story is the room that's reflected in it. So that's an example of where you get in close. But hopefully then that gives you a couple of ideas there, Rosemary, to play with. But thank you for sending that one in and for your question. Right, okay. Where are we? So, Roy says that was helpful. Thank you. Yeah, excellent. Glad it was. April says, so adorable. Rosemary, and sorry to hear about the cat. Viji says, adorable. Sandra also says, lovely photo, adorable cat. Obviously, adorable is the word for this cat. Stacey says, just usual of an animal on top of the clothes. You have to think of the whole idea beyond the cuteness. Meg says, very, very cute cat. Ayres says, a sconce. Rosemary says, thank you all for your kind words. We miss our boy. I love the vertical take. Hadn't thought of that. Where are we? Oh, April says, good idea, Eric. Meg says, sorry to hear about that, Rosemary. And Stacey says, I love taking memories of my pets. It's hard when they're gone. This is true. Right, okay, so let's move on then. So I'm now going to go to Robert. Yes, okay, Robert. So now, Robert says, I'm trying to dive into black and white photography. Not all photos lend themselves to black and white, but I want to understand how to bring out the best story in a picture. The edits that I've done are using the color mixer and desaturating each channel. Let's actually, before I go too much further, show you the photo that Robert has sent in. So Robert's found this amazing old car, and he's been playing with the black and white. So he goes on to say that he's been using luminance sliders, adjusting brightness of color channels, playing with shadows, highlights, clarity, dehaze, and slightly adjusted for effect. In essence, Robert has been turning this to black and white and using as many different tricks and tips and everything else that he can to try and really draw out the texture of this car. He says the picture is of a 1960 Pontiac Star Chief Sedan. It's not a very common car, and it's a style that captures that style shift between the 1950s and 1960s. I think the broken window, the cables holding down the hood closed, make it feel like it's barely keeping it together. The background is a little distracting, according to Anne, but I think the Trump flag and the uncared for nature of the houses add to the theme of barely keeping it together. What I'm looking for is how to keep the focus on a theme and story in black and white. My hope is to use your advice to edit all my cut photos in black and white and then add the colour back. The idea is that black and white makes you focus on the stories of composition and story, whereas adding colour just enhances or detracts from the narrative. Please let me know what your take is on this idea and demonstrate with my photo if it lends itself to the concept. Okay, well, there's a couple of things going on here. One is the notion you're working with an idea here that essentially, if you remove the colour and just deal with black and white, that's going to help you zero in on where the story is. And then if you edit according to that, in that style, to really understand the story, then if necessary, you can bring the colour back in. Now, a couple of tricky things here. One is, if you edit it in black and white, you've kind of then lost the colour. Adding the colour back in afterwards isn't necessarily going to work. There is also the fact that editing, you tend to edit in black and white for contrast of tone, light and dark, whereas in colour you might be editing for light and dark, but you're also editing for colour balance. So this part here might be reddish, this part here might be greenish, this part here might be bluish. Where are the balances? So that your editing colour is a different process to editing black and white, and I don't know that you can necessarily just say that, well, okay, if I remove colour for the distraction, edit in black and white, and then allow the colour to come back in, that it's going to be the same, because I don't think it is. I really don't think it is. I mean, I'm open to debate on this one, and maybe this is something we could have a Zoom call over and talk about and debate, and you can try and convince me otherwise. But my first instincts are that I know that I edit a black and white photo in a different way than the way that I edit a colour photo. You may remember a few weeks ago, I was doing a little black and white conversion of a sweet pea flower, and the flower had a kind of purple upper and a kind of magenta pink lower. And when we just desaturated, the difference between that purple and magenta wasn't very much. Whereas when you looked at the colour, the difference between the purple and the magenta was massive, and that's what created the power of the photo, was the colour contrast. But when you desaturated it, it didn't. And so in order to get that contrast, we lightened the magenta and we darkened the purple. So that actually now, to get that contrast, we had a contrast of tonal range rather than colour range. So quite simply, what that does is that tells us that there are different styles of doing it. So yeah, I'm not totally convinced that that's necessarily, on a philosophical level, the best way to go about editing a photo. I can understand you wanting to pursue black and white, because black and white has a different aesthetic, but then I think you need to understand the way you're doing a black and white. Now, the next problem that you have is that some photos lend themselves really well to black and white, not all do. And it makes it trickier sometimes with the editing process if you decide to go down the black and white route. Now, when I look at this photo here, lovely car, interesting car, but you're right, the background is distracting. But part of the problem that we have with the background is not separated enough from the car itself. So at a quick glance, you don't necessarily know that that's a roof. You know, is this just a kind of, actually the roof of the car could be slightly crumpled, or that could be a bit of a sunroof that hasn't folded back down properly. You know, but if I zoom in, okay, now I can pick out that that's a roof, but it's not separated out very much. There are all sorts of bits here where it's a busy background. It's a busy background which isn't allowing for that separation. When you go into black and white, because it's a very textured kind of background, there's not enough separation. So it's a difficult one. I kind of wouldn't really start here. And there's another bit here which grabs me about your story as well. When you talk about the fact that I think the Trump flag, oh, there's a Trump flag. Where's the Trump flag? Now, if I zoom in over here, here we go. Here's your Trump flag. But in a colour version, that Trump flag is red. In the black and white, it isn't. So your mention of the Trump flag, also the Lone Star flag up here and what have you, and the flags up here are not in colour either. So they just become part of the general texture. So if you're feeling that these aspects are actually contributing to the story, by turning them into black and white, you've kind of lost it. I mean, there are other bits over here, maybe like, you know, that looks like some kind of wheelie bin or something. So your sense of things trying to be a bit run down in the background has been lost by putting it into black and white. It's an amazing car, and I think, you know, and I can see why you wanted to take it, and I would want to take a photo of that car, but there's this background, so what are you going to do about it? So, okay, now, fortunately, Robert sent me the raw file, so let's just open this up in Camera Raw, and, oh, sorry, that's Roy's one, cancel that, sorry about that. Right, so here then is our raw file, and I can see you've added on a little bit at the front with the editing, which is probably just as well because the car does feel a little bit slightly more to the front, but that's okay. Let's start with this. Let's zoom in, and very quickly so what have you at? You're 320th of a second, 7.1 ISO 320. It's not a super high ISO, but given the fact that there's going to be a little bit of editing going on with it, let's just bring up a little bit of noise reduction just as a starter. And now if I do auto, don't know that it's really doing much. but we'll do an auto edit just so that we know that we're getting a kind of a little range, you know, that some of the detail has been brought back out of the highlights, although it's a very dull sky. So there's a difficulty here that even when we look at this in colour, there's not a lot of tonal range in this either. And if we just very straightforwardly, before you've done your edits, we go to hue, saturation and desaturate, we can see exactly this problem here of separation out. There's not, it's how do you make the subject stand out from the background? Now, first of all, we'll straighten that bit here, get that up there, and then we'll use the content aware, bring a little bit out the front. That's not quite done what I wanted. Oh, that's because I'm on the wrong layer. So we'll straighten that up, bring a little bit out the front, just so we've got, and then maybe crop that up a little bit, something like that. Slightly more cinematic. That still hasn't done what I wanted to. Okay, that's because I forgot to do the content aware. Let's just use the spot healing tool and do that for a moment, just so we've got a bit of front of it, so we're not worrying about it. Okay, we've got a front. We can let go of that bit. So now we've got this. Well, let's come back to the edit here. And again, what we've got, it's like if I go select, let's use Photoshop select subject, and select subject has become really, the algorithms of this have whacked up considerably, and we can see that it's selected, but we can also see that it's having difficulty. Down by the tyre, it's not really separating out between where the tyre and the ground is. That tyre's got left out completely. And come back to this roof problem. Instead of selecting the top of the roof, it's selected this building behind the roof as well. And then it's selected part of this fence here. So what we can see is that it's not just me, even Photoshop sophisticated algorithms aren't necessarily sure where the eye is instantly getting drawn to. So what can we do here to try and bring out or change the background? So let's say we were to I'll tell you what, let's see if I can loosely select this, the car this way round. We'll do something like this, and I'm going to do it very roughly. You would obviously spend more time on it, kind of selecting the car here. I'm trying to get a little bit more of, just get that little bit of roof in there, but also I'll use the Alt key to try and get rid of that bit of building over there, and we've kind of selected the car here. Now what we can do is, if I inverse that selection, and let's say we want to blur that background a little bit. So if I go to filter, camera raw filter, no, not camera raw, wrong one, cancel that. I'm going to filter blur, Gaussian blur. Now we've got to be careful here, because if we blur it too much, it's just going to look a bit weird if we don't blur it enough. So we're kind of nudging it, and around here I think there's a limit to where we can go before it's going to start looking a bit too odd. And in this case I'm not going to go any further than about 7, maybe down to 6.5, something like that. Now, as well as blurring the background, it's blurred the foreground, which looks a little bit odd. So tell you what we should have done. I should have done that on a separate layer. So let's go back. Let's duplicate that. Okay, I'm going to have to go back even further. We've cropped that, done the spot healing tool, duplicate that layer. Let's just blur the whole layer and then paint it out. Okay, so I'm going to blur the whole layer, mask it, and then just I'm just going to unmask the car itself and this foreground here, because otherwise it's going to look a little bit too odd. You get a little touch of blur right down the bottom here, but for the most part you're wanting to get the car and the sort of grass around it, and then allow that background to just be very slightly blurred. That's creating a little bit of separation, not huge amounts, but a little bit. Now, another thing we can do here, I think, is playing around with that idea of desaturation is to partially desaturate the background. So if I go back to hue saturation and desaturate, now I don't want to desaturate the whole lot. If I want to create this standing out from the background, if I take this down and sort of semi-desaturate like that. Now, so we take that down to, so we've still got some colour, but what I'm going to do now is exactly the same way I just did with the blurring, is I'm going to paint back in the colour on the car. So it's a little bit like doing selective colour, but it's not going as strong as selective colour. We're not making the whole thing black and white. What we're doing is we are just sort of softening out the background to allow the car to stand out a little bit more. So between the blurred background and the desaturating, we're doing that. Now, another thing we could do, actually, the other thing with this desaturation, maybe what we want to do is we will in fact just mask out and get that Trump sign back in. Let's just allow that red to come back through there, and maybe in the flag up there. And then that way, now you could, it's a kind of a bit of a gamble, you know, it might be kind of dragging a little bit of attention, but if you figure them to be key storytelling parts of the narrative, is to have those bits in, then maybe you want to make sure that they are being noticed. If you wanted, maybe you could get a little bit more of the red of the barn up there, but that's maybe less necessary. So, but then maybe what we also want to do is highlight the kind of the rust level in the car as well. So between these layers here, I'm going to put another hue saturation so that it's only doing this level and not the above layer. And if I go to the reds, if I drag that saturation up, then you can see everything gets kind of oversaturated. But I'm going to pull that up so that it's really highlighting the rust. And I realize actually that should be between that layer. That's the ones that I want, so that it's not doing all the rest. Now, maybe I've kind of slightly overdone it with that. So let's just find a sort of somewhere reasonable in between. And there, so what we've got now is we're working on this whole problem of the fact that this car blends into its background too much. So we're trying, but dramatic changes, darkening the background too much, or blurring the background too much, or making the background completely black and white. All these things are just, you've got to kind of be careful. So we're combining multiple layers of subtlety. So we've got desaturating the background, we've got blurring the background, and now we've got highlighting the rusty red in the car itself. So now what we might want to do, if I combine those all into one layer, so I copy, cancel that, right, select all, no, copy, paste, that's what I'm trying to do. Maybe then at this point, what I can also do is, let's add in a little bit of a vignette. I'm going to go to the optics and just to kind of draw that little bit in. And then, as a final layer, another way to make this stand out is to then play around with the clarity tool. We're essentially now going to up the texture and contrast within this car, just the car. So if I grab that clarity slider and pull it now, that's making the shadows too dark. So I'm going to take the highlights down a bit, bring the shadows up a bit, drag the clarity. Although this is doing this across the whole picture, again, we're going to mask it. So just kind of look what's happening with the car. And can I drag that a little bit more? So we're kind of grungy. We're kind of doing that kind of, it's like grungying up the car a little bit. Now I click OK. Now again, fully mask it back out, and then paint in just that extra layer of grungy texture onto the car itself, but not onto the foreground or background. So we've now got these several layers where we've blurred background, desaturated the background, enhanced the red of the rust on the car and now enhance the contrast levels in the car as well. Maybe as a final layer, if we really wanted, if I take the curves and that wasn't what I meant to do, just pull that down, do something like that. And again, that's maybe too far, but let's just see what happens. Allow the car to brighten up. So we're kind of just darkening the background down a little bit, something like that. Now I feel I've probably overdone it a little bit here. Certainly I can see a line here, so maybe do 50% and just kind of feather it in a little bit more, but then maybe just overall just take that, drag that a bit until it just starts to darken down a bit. And then the final thing, don't forget, we always have this problem with levels. We can notice here, we can just nudge that up a little bit so that the whole thing stands out a little bit more. So what we do now then, if I just group all that lot together, then we can see the difference between that and that. And that then, Robert, is how we managed to try and make the car stand out a bit more. But the thing is, whilst we have done blurring the background to help it stand out a bit more, we have done desaturating the background to help it stand out from the background a bit more. In order to also make it stand out, we have enhanced colour on this. We've enhanced the rust, and we haven't allowed it to desaturate in the way that we desaturated the background. Okay, so I think in this particular picture, if we go back to your original black and white picture, yes, feels absolutely timeless. That might have been taken yesterday, or it might have been taken 30 years ago, 40 years ago even. It's timeless, but the car itself isn't really standing out. And given the fact that the narrative of this is about this absolutely rusty car that's being held to. The other thing, I mean, it's like when you talk about the hood strap, the strap that's holding the hood on. You can't really see it in that one. Whereas here, because it, you've got the Husky written on there, but because it's actually got red on it, it stands out that bit more. So all the little bits that you're kind of wanting to draw a highlight to, the rust, the strap, the broken window, all now stand out that little bit more. So I hope that helps. Like I say, it's not a black and white edit, but I don't think a black and white edit is really going to work for you here. I think, you've probably gone and done what you could with the black and white edit. There's a lot of work gone into this. You've played a lot with getting the textures out of it, but that background is just not separate enough. And I think really for something like this, because, I mean, again, even with all these edits, if I go straightforwardly and desaturate, we are straight back into the problem of the fact that it's not separated enough from the background. We still can't tell whether that's the roof of the building behind or whether it's a crumpled roof. So, whereas because we've brought out the rust in that, it has created a separation, and the background is that little bit more out of focus. It's easier to create that separation. So, I hope that helps, Robert. I hope that gives you a few ideas to play around with. Right, okay, I see we have more comments. Where are we? So, Stacey says, love old vehicles. I do like the monochrome. April says, great shot, Robert. Sandra says, great old car. John says, very cool car, great subject. Viji, for a second I thought the roof of the car was split and looked like a hut. Later I noticed it was the roof of the house behind. Okay, so Viji's noticed what we were chatting about. Robert says, I think what I'm looking for in editing black and white is getting better at black and white editing, but also focusing on composition, like Rosemary. You always give a great perspective. Okay, I understand, but I think really it's a case of also choosing your subject. Not all subjects work best in black and white. Anne says, great advice on the background. We debated on what he might or might not do with the background. VG says, I like the coloured one with its rust and grass patches. Roy says, I need to leave now, but we'll catch up on YouTube. Oh, okay. Cheers then, Roy. Catch you soon. April says, too bad Photoshop can't figure out the car is obviously the object the photographer was alluding to. It makes it more complicated. It's not a case of two. The reason I was showing that was to actually show the limitations of, and that if Photoshop with all its sophistication is still struggling there, it's not about damning Photoshop. It's about showing where the complications are with the photo itself, and the way that because of the fact that it's not standing out against the background enough, that it's really difficult. That it means that you have to take that into consideration. Where are we? April says, what if you put it in old-fashioned monochrome? Well, fine, you could put it into a kind of sepia colour, but you would still have exactly the same problem. You're still going to have the same problem whether it's black or white. If you go monochrome, if you're losing... The point being is that this picture doesn't work well enough in a single tone. Monochrome being whether it's black and white or brown and white or green and white or red and white. There's not enough range in the tones to make it stand out from the background. So I am manipulating the color levels, desaturating the background, enhancing the rust in the car itself in order to help create that separation. Hope that makes sense. John says different background would be preferred for sure. Unfortunately, it didn't look like that car was going very far. Robert says, yes, that does make it stand out more. I think you're correct about keeping it in colour. It does give it more contrast to the background and helps focus the attention to the details. Stacey said, could possibly have had a different angle, maybe standing more in front of the car or maybe a little further away. Absolutely, and I don't doubt for a moment that Robert will have sort of probably taken about 400 photos from lots of different angles with these ones. But sometimes what you want is that's the angle of the car you want. And that's the one but then it is a case of how do you do the background. Sometimes if the background is going to be too busy and you can't move the car or drive it off to some beautiful desert scene or something, then maybe you do have to just change your angle and go, what's the background and how is the background either enhancing or detracting or interfering with what it is I'm trying to photograph. And if you have full control over everything, so you can stick the car on a pickup truck and drop it off outside a desert and move it around and change the angle of it until the sunlight is hitting it the right direction, then brilliant. If you can't, if you're limited, then what you're asking yourself is what's the best I can get given the circumstances that I have. Right, okay, that pretty much brings us to the end of this. What I would just remind you all is that the clocks go forward next week. Please make sure that you double check the timings so that if you are out with the UK, that it might mean that there's a shift. So Google the time difference before we get there. And another little reminder that if you do find these podcasts interesting, useful, entertaining, and you would like to support them, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. And finally, make sure you get your images in for next week. Okay, I do have a limited number of slots. And if pictures come in too late and other people have taken them up, then you won't get it in. But this really is the place where you can get the best advantage for improving your understanding of photography. Send your own images in, tell me what the sticking points are, and then you get a customized, tailored response to your problem and your picture. Right, okay. April's asked a question, when is the UK going to change their clocks? And yes, I understand what you said. So the clocks get changed Saturday night, or it's really Sunday morning at 2 a.m. UK time. The clocks go forward. What it means is that the next podcast on the 26th of March, the time change will have happened. And essentially, we'll be catching up with the daylight savings time that happened in the US a couple of weeks ago. So it will go back to whatever you were doing a couple of weeks ago. Right, okay. That's us. We'll find that one to do. Yep. Thank you ever so much for everybody who's turned up. Thank you to Viji, to Robert, to Rosemary, and to Roy for sending their images in. Make sure you get your images in for next week. And have a good week, everyone. And once again, happy Mother's Day to all mothers out there. Take care. Bye-bye.